So, acquiring and analyzing environmental data to tell stories for journalists and scientists. So, and one of the reasons that I include "and scientists" for this is, scientists, the world has changed. Everybody can be a publisher. You can find your own stories, and they don't. How do I put it? The data you use for your research is not always the data you want to use to tell the story of your research. In other words, you may have found something by analyzing one data set. The best story to tell it may come in another context that's informed by your research. You may have discovered some relationship, and with a really complicated, multi-level model involving statistical things that even I, as a nerdy numbers guy, have trouble keeping track of. That's great. But you want to simplify, and sometimes that simple version is just a map, right? Sometimes that simple version is just here's something that's happening. Now I'm going to explain to you based on my research why. Okay, so about me, I'm an assistant professor at the University of Iowa. I contribute to places like 538, the New York Times, and PolitiFact. So what is news? Right. Journalists are a type of news producer, not the only type, but journalists are a type of news producer. What's news?
Anything that happened.
Anything that happened is news.
Yes.
So I got up and had breakfast, and that's news?
Yep, and if you were writing and your audience was your mother, that would be news to her.
Okay, so everything is news to someone.
It is news too.
I think it would not be news to my mother that I ate breakfast. She might be happy, but I don't think it would be news to her. So I'm going to say this. These are, and I say that these are sort of journalists' news values, but they're really not. The journalists kind of invented and discovered these, but these are a sort of a way of pushing people's buttons to pay attention to a certain kind of information. And that certain kind of information is what we generally think of as information of lowercase p, public, lowercase I, interest. Sometimes that information of interest to the public is also in the capital P, public, capital I, interest, but those are not necessarily the same thing. So I'm just going to trust me, we'll get to the data in a minute, but these are the different buttons you can push to when you're looking to see if something is news and or when you're trying to make something into news. So, empathy, right? There are things about this story that make you feel something. Generally, you have empathy with other people, but also with animals. Stories about cute puppies always win. Proximity is both physical and social. So things that are close to your audience, both in terms of geographic proximity and in terms of the social graph. So the example I always use, something happened, if you're a University of Iowa student, something happens to a University of Iowa student while they're in Africa, you're still really interested in that. Because proximity is not just physical, it is also social. Okay. Prominence, does it involve famous people, places, or things? This is a really easy button to push. Unfortunately, it's usually a really useless button to push. This is why the anti-vaxxer movement has been so successful, is there's a bunch of famous, crazy people who are against vaccines. Surprise, right? You may have, this is a phrase that literally TV stations love to use. exploding strollers of death, is your child at risk? The answer may surprise you. Impact, how much effect does it have on your audience? Currency, how relevant is it to what is going on with your audience right now? Not necessarily timeliness. Timeliness is how long ago did it happen, right? You can think of timeliness as the moment it happens is its highest level of timeliness, and after that it just gets less and less timely. Currency is how relevant it is to what's going on at the moment, right? We might think that certain things about McCarthyism, and in particular the things that were depicted in Good Night and Good Luck, in terms of Ed Murrow's fight with McCarthy, have some currency in our current society because they're relevant to some of the other debates that are going on, but obviously they are not timely. Finally, big red ball up in the corner is conflict. And by the way, there is an order to this. So these are the two that are usually the most relevant to sort of scientific and environmental stories. Impact and currency. Prominence and conflict are sort of the least relevant. The sizing of these has to do with a mean notion of newsworthiness across typical news outlets. So conflict is the biggest ball on this thing. Journalists love to cover conflict. Unfortunately, right, science is not hopefully about conflict. So when we're writing stories about science and we push the conflict button and we see them through the conflict lens, this is where we tend to get issues of false balance. It's a real danger because not just journalists, the public expects conflict. The public consumes stories about conflict. Any play, any novel involves, right, the setting up and resolution of a conflict. That is literally how plot works. My mother's a playwright. Like, this is what you do when you are designing a plot. You set up conflicts and then you resolve them. So, you'll note that the next biggest thing that you can push is this one, proximity. Social and physical proximity. In combination with some of this other stuff, is the strongest way to engage your audience with a story. It's the strongest way to get people invested. You are writing about people, about places that are near you, or people to whom you have a connection, a social connection. That might be a really close social connection, like, again, the University of Iowa student who dies while studying abroad. And this might be a second or third order. Farmers have sort of there's a connection to other farmers, even if they're elsewhere in the world. Sort of a social network there. Okay. Now, usually, what we want to do is get people to understand this, right? This blue ball. We want people to understand about the impact. But impact and empathy, which are actually the two smallest balls on this, in terms of, again, the tip now, different news organizations weight their coverage differently based on these. And different people, different audience members, react differently to these levers. And the combination of those, people tend to consume the media that most closely matches. But we're going to come back to this, but particularly, right, if you're not at the New York Times, this proximity button is really important. If you're a scientist wanting to communicate with journalists, you need to understand that. Most journalists work for publications that have a geographical agenda. Some journalists don't. Some journalists, BuzzFeed, for example, BuzzFeed is a national news organization that defines its audience based on some audience demographics, not based on a geographic universe. But, all right. Right, so what is a story? If we're going to tell stories, we need to think about what a story is. Right? There are different structures, and the structures that you use often depend on the news values that are at play. Pretty typical, common ones, right? Journalists in the room, right? The inverted pyramid. You start with the most important thing, and you work your way down to the least important thing. The hourglass is a version of that. You start with the most important thing, you kind of explain that, and then you work back out from there to include the other important stuff. So it's sort of a thematic. By the way, I take these terms from a woman named Jackie Benezinski, who has not trademarked the other ones, but she's really smart. And she teaches even though she taught at the University of Missouri, I have deep respect for her. So the narrative, right? And then the broken narrative. So a lot of the most effective environmental and science writing uses what we call the broken narrative, which is where you intersperse a narrative story with exposition, which is a way of tricking people into eating their vegetables, right? You give them a nice story to follow, and then to get from one part to another, they have to eat their vegetables and read the explanation of what that story meant. All right. So there are some different approaches. Regardless of structure, there are just some different approaches to making environmental data or environmental issues into a story. And these are the basic, I would say, this is kind of the basic deck that you're going to be able to deal from on most environmental stories. All right? You can have a top or a bottom 10, right? This is really effective. People want to know what's best and what's worst. They also, we're designed for it. It's just part of our psychobiology. We really want to, the more than zero, what I call the more than zero story, right? More than zero have this circumstance that probably shouldn't happen, right? More than zero schools have been built in the last 10 years in places with high concentrations of airborne lead. If that were true, which it is. Right? That shouldn't happen, right? We know that airborne lead, not a good thing, right? We know that it has severe neurological things on developing brains, yet we have school districts that have decided to put schools in places where there are high concentrations of airborne lead and literally bus students into an area where we are damaging their brain development. This is not a story I reported, but this has been reported. Okay. Not good, right? More than zero cases. That shouldn't, it's just when you have identified something that shouldn't happen, and that, of course, lends itself to telling an individual story, which can be very compelling. Right? The what we found may surprise you. This, including the big number, right? 374 schools have been built in places, right? That's the variation, right? It's not just more than zero. It's here's a big number. Here's a number that is going to impress you, which is a variation on the what we found may surprise you. Most stories about new research fall into this category of what we found may surprise you. Here's something that was found, and we're going to frame it as new and interesting and surprising. That's an important framing device because it gets people to pay attention. As we talked about before, it's sort of problematic because that's not really how science works, right? Science doesn't work of hey, here's a big new thing, and we suddenly, it happens once in a while, right? There's oh, we have a total paradigm shift in this field, and we see everything in a different way. But usually what happens is research builds on the last research, which builds on more research, and knowledge doesn't develop linearly, but it sort of moves along in a generally forward motion. And then there's the tale and the collection of tales. So, right, there's a lot of structures, right? The Canterbury Tales is a collection of tales, right? They have nothing to do with each other, but they're all together in one book. Or the single really compelling narrative. And those are both ways to tell a human story, right? Both of those involve searching out relevant people and touching that empathy button, right? What we want to do in that case usually is build empathy. That's what those individual stories do, and that's why those individual stories are effective. Now, they're also effective at getting people to pay attention, because empathy is an aspect of what makes things newsworthy, what makes people pay attention. It also, and I'm not a rhetorician, but it is a large component of persuasion. Brandy, am I? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So, all right, so with that said, I'm going to go through real quick for journalists. Data.gov. This is a badly organized, badly devised collection of data that is available from the federal government. It's really painful to use, but it is a better starting place than Google for finding data about any issue, including environmental issues. You can do some filtering. At the state level, data.iowa.gov is actually pretty well structured and pretty good, and actually has a pretty good search function. And you can find interesting, relevant data to a variety of these issues. Who knows what a COG is? Journalists, who knows what a COG is? Yeah. COG.
All of a sudden, I think it can be several things, so you go ahead.
COG is a council of governments. So COGs are a type of metropolitan planning organization. That's another term that gets used. But these are associations of local governments. Every metropolitan and micropolitan area in the United States has one. They do a variety of things. One of the main things they act as is a clearinghouse for data on things like land use and transportation in their regions. And they tend to collect a lot of really interesting data for the that is frequently ignored by policymakers, and they're usually very willing. If they don't have it on their website, they're usually very willing to share it with you. The Environmental Working Group, EWG. This is an info advocacy group. They're not really an advocacy group, but they have an agenda, which is. But they don't really advocate specific policies. So they're sort of in that weird netherworld between like a full-on political action committee and sort of independent journalistic type outlet, but they do a lot of great research on a variety of environmental issues, and they release a lot of the data that they get. They also are pretty active in filing Freedom of Information Act requests to get things that the federal government collects but does not, because of people like Scott Pruitt, want to release. RTK.net. This is a good one. It was started by, it has gone through a couple of variations of various now defunct organizations. RTK stands for Right to Know. But it is now sponsored by the Houston Chronicle, because good citizens. And they have some data, and I'm actually going to pull that up. Hazardous waste, the National Response Center, which you can get separately. But this is spills and accidents. It's actually collected by the Coast Guard. They started it because it was for collecting oil spills. It has acquired a large number of other jobs over the years, sort of because it's the Coast Guard, I'm going to say, have accreted onto it like barnacles. The risk management plans. Federal law requires that facilities use large amounts of extremely hazardous file risk management plans. So this used to be available under FOIA. Since 9/11, the federal government, in the guise of anti-terrorism, but giving into a long-time demand by the companies that have these toxic chemicals, has gone down to doing the bare minimum required by law, which is that you can go to a local EPA reading room and visually inspect the plans. But the last versions that were acquired under FOIA when it was still available are here. And the toxic release inventory, TRI, is a really important environmental database. It is what it sounds like. If a facility regulated by the EPA releases toxic materials, it goes into the inventory. That may mean exceeding EPA requirements exceeding EPA regulations on something that they regularly release, and it may mean releasing something that they don't normally release. Those are all good sources for local stories. Okay. So those are, let's see. All right, so, okay. We'll talk about how a few different stories that have been created from data, local and non-local stories, how they got it, how they did it, walk you through. So tier 2 data, technically that emergency response category is what's called tier 1 data. It's very in-depth. Tier 2 data is a much broader set of potentially dangerous chemicals. Any facility that stores them has to report it to the state and federal government, well, the state government, which is then reported to the federal government. It is available under state but not federal open records laws because that's the reporting structure. Some years ago, Reuters, after a explosion in the town of West Texas, highlighted some of the dangerous chemicals that were on hand in places, requested this data from every state. Some states complied, some states didn't. But this story actually was a pretty good primer on how to get that information and the kind of things that are on there. Speaking of risk, this is to some extent a data set about risk, but it is also a good guide for you on polluters and potential polluters, because if you have things on hand that are potentially toxic, right, you may also be a place that regularly releases things that are potentially toxic. Some things that might not show up, that might not be well regulated when they're released in small quantities, when they are known about when they're stored in large quantities. And so this becomes a pattern that you can look for if you're looking for particular things. The other thing is this gives you, if you are writing about a particular chemical or a particular issue, this allows you to zoom in on that proximity. This allows you to say, hey, Grinnell, there are 42 places within 30 miles of Grinnell that have more than, 1 million gallons of anhydrous ammonia or whatever. Probably not, but that would be a lot of anhydrous. So this is not actually the data set they used. They used it for data from the COG in Western Washington, but an organization called Investigate West did a significant investigation on schools that were being built in areas with significant air pollution, much of which came from transportation. So came from being near the major interstates. That's why it's called exhausted at school. They were really looking at pollution from vehicle exhaust, which, by the way, is one of the largest sources of toxic air pollution that you experience. Preschoolers face health hazards at daycare, right? Like I said. One place that you can look for this kind of information is what is called the National Air Toxics Assessment. EPA collects it. The last one is as of 2014. They really are due for another one, but we'll see. We'll see if we ever get it, if they do it. What?
2020 we'll get one, or 2021.
Yes, but it's overdue compared to the previous frequency. There should already have been another one. The fact that it's not coming till 2021 makes me. These are the things that 2021.
I was just joking about the political system,
Oh, I
like
see.
someone new.
Okay. So it has been some years since one was done, but it's still very relevant. It is based on a model based on point sources, but it will give you level information at the census tract level and sometimes the sub-census tract level of the health risks of the chemicals of air pollutants and the health risks related to air pollutants at various places. This can be, again, if you're writing about these issues, right, and you want to write about them locally, this is where you can say, hey, this neighborhood has a really high level of X, benzene, airborne benzene, sure, right? And you can zoom in. And that can be really relevant when, let's say, you're reading some research and you say, hey, this is this interesting new research about airborne benzene. I'm just making this up, but airborne benzene is really a bad thing. You don't want to breathe it, and yet you do. Right, this is where you can say, oh, here's this neighborhood in our coverage area, right, that has this census tract is roughly a neighborhood that has a high level of this. And, then, you go to the park in the neighborhood and you stand there and you talk to people till somebody, right? You can literally just do man on the street interviews at that point. Okay. Right. And this was definitely a more than zero story, but it ended up being a big number story. It turns out, because of the way schools are built, a large number of them were built next to these very busy roads. Busy roads were very large sources of things that you really wouldn't want your kids breathing, and yet they were. All right, so the National Response Center, they collect a lot of different kinds of data. One of the things they collect data on are toxic releases and chemical accidents, which is sort of a broad swath of things. What we discovered was that 80% of the chemical accident data are wrong because we compared this database to two other databases that should have overlapped with it, and we found that they regularly disagreed with each other. And even when they did agree with each other, they were often wrong. We were able to track down cases. This is a picture from something that shows up in all the databases as a explosion involving one fatality. It actually killed a busload of nursing home residents who were, I believe, on their way to a casino. Water quality. USGS collects nationwide data on water quality, They really do. It's really good. It's really detailed. If you're writing about water quality issues, go to the National Water Quality Monitoring Council website. There's a ton of stuff there, right? And it's a ton of stuff that lets you zoom into, hey, here's this thing that we're writing about nitrates that we found out. Here's a stream, right, that has a particularly high level. And it doesn't have to be the highest level, right, but it lets you zoom into that microscopic view. Okay. So the final advice I have with you on working on any of these data sets as a journalist is to find your spiritual guide, which may or may not be Rabbi Mel Brooks. These are really hard stories to do. As a journalist, if you don't happen to also be an environmental scientist, it's really hard to sort through this stuff. You need some patient experts who care about this stuff enough to be willing to take lots of stupid questions from you. I always try, as I'm doing these projects, to find a few of those. And at the end of the day, I make sure I quote them in my stories, just, because they put a lot of work into the story too, and they deserve to be recognized in my reporting as one of my sources of information. But it's a hard, I would say it's sort of a kind of a uncomfortable thing for us to think about, right? Which is because we value our independence, we value being like the scorpion in the story of the scorpion and the frog, right? We'll sting anybody, no matter how good they are to us. Even so, it's important to have guides into these foreign territories and to find them and identify them. Universities are really good places to find folks like this. They are full of people who are passionate about their very small piece of the world. Right? I was doing a story on misconduct at a hospital. This is not an environmental story, but it is a complicated data story. I tracked down a guy who's the world's expert on human factors issues in medical situations. This is not a big literature. Maybe it should be, but the intersection of human factors research and the various medical things, there were a small number of people who had a lot of expertise. And I found one of them and talked to him a bunch and cultivated him, and eventually we developed a relationship where I could take stories to him and get a take on them. And that's, if you're a reporter covering these issues, one of the things you need to do, or who wants to cover these issues, you need to find ways to just build this base of trusted sources, right? People who can really advise you, people who you can say, hey, there's this new study and here's what it seems to be saying. Is this worth me digging into? Right? Is this worth me putting a month into localizing it and finding this stuff? It doesn't mean that you always follow that person's judgment, and you should have more than one of these folks, but you really need them. And the bigger the project you're getting into, the more you need them. And the other part of this is, if you are doing your own data analysis, you need someone to vet it. We don't have peer review, right? Journalists don't have peer review. We just publish stuff. And so you need to have your own process to make sure that it's right. All right, any questions? Yeah.
So one thing that we often encounter is when we're reporting on data to journalists or to students in a classroom, it seems like it's really old stuff.
Yeah.
But the way that government dates data is when the data is when the data are collected rather than when they're released.
Yeah.
So an example is the National Air Toxics Assessment.
Yeah.
2014 data was released in 2018.
Yeah.
2011 data was released in 2015.
Right.
So if they're doing it in 2018, we'll expect to see it in 2022. And then when you
Yeah.
report on it, or I talk about it to students, why is he telling us about 4-year-old data? That's the most recent
Yeah.
data available, because it takes that long to collect
Right.
it, analyze
See-
it, process it, publish it, vet it, peer review
Yes.
it, and put it out there.
Yes, that's true. And I shouldn't have picked on the air toxics for that reason. I was just trying to find an excuse to pick on the current EPA.
Well, it should have come out in 17, and they delayed
Yeah.
it to 18, so there you
That was, there we go. So, yeah, it should have come out in 17, shouldn't it? I mean, one thing to do is, right, you can use a news peg that is this newly released data, which I have written about 1,000 leads that say, da-da-da-da-da, according to newly released data. And then there's the other, or previously unreleased data. That's a slightly, if the data should have been released sooner and hasn't been, you can say previously unreleased data, which makes it sound like somebody was hiding something. That's part of it. And part of it is that really with data stories, we can't usually lean very hard on timeliness. Timeliness is great, but it's just, and we can use it as a peg for new research, but when we're looking at data, even if you started looking at the data the minute it was collected, by the time even you on journalistic turnarounds are getting done with it, the timeliness is really going to be going away. Now, this button, this other time button, currency can be really good. Currency is hard. Right, the story that we did about chemical safety data and that Reuters did on Tier 2 both came after this explosion in West Texas. Right, these are the issues that we highlighted were at play in West Texas, but had been in play for decades. Right, we were taking off of the news, off of something that was current, and saying, okay, here are the underlying causes, and reporting and citing research that had been done over the years. A great story I like to remember in terms of this, right? This of currency. So I grew up in Seattle. We have ferry boats there. Does everybody remember a little movie called Titanic? All right, so when that movie was coming out, the Seattle Times released that weekend, released a giant story on how the Washington State ferries did not have enough lifeboats and life jackets. Right? Yeah. Whoops, right? Right? Now, this was something that they learned of not that long before. Somebody called them up because of this, and literally, I know the reporter literally said, "Hey, people are talking about this movie Titanic. That could happen on the ferry boat here." And I also happen to know that reporter rides the ferry every day, so maybe that had something to do with it as well when he learned that. But right, that's taking current events and saying, "Oh, here's this story." Right? And that's I did sort of color code these as just sort of things that are on a similar axis, right? Timeliness and currency have a nice relationship to each other. They're both time-based, and you can often find, even if something is not timely, you find a news peg that is. And I will say, for those of you who are scientists trying to get attention to important issues, finding a way to hang on to something else that is going on, maybe it's not the study that you just released. Maybe it's something that you released 3 years ago, which in science time is pretty recent, right? It doesn't have to be your most recent paper. When you find that news peg, that's a great time to reach out. And by the way, scientists, advise you when you're trying to tell these stories, even if you're telling them yourself, and I advise, like, it's a great time to write a blog post. It's a great time to get on Twitter and talk about it.